The city was waking up in a gray haze, the morning rays barely shining through the windows of a small house on the outskirts. Inside the house, the only thing that broke the silence was the steady, monotonous noise of the oxygen machine. For 10-year-old Livian, this sound was a necessity of life. Without it, his weak lungs, which seemed to have fought an endless war for every drop of air since birth, would simply stop working. Livian sat in his wheelchair near the window, looking out at the street where children his age were playing ball noisily. Their laughter tore the boy's heart like a knife, leaving no chance to forget that he couldn't be one of them. Even the simplest movement, leaving the house, going for a walk, it was all a complicated logistical operation. His mother, Irene, checked the oxygen levels in the tanks every morning, carefully checked the fastenings of the mask on her son's face, and prayed that the device wouldn't fail. "Mom, if I didn't have this hose, would you let me play with them?" he asked one day, staring at the children outside the window. Irene froze. She knew she couldn't lie to him, but the truth was unbearable. "You could do anything, Livian," she finally replied, stroking his head gently, "and you can too. Just not right now." Those words didn't bring relief. Livian wasn't stupid. He'd seen people in the supermarket stop and stare at him. He'd heard the whispers. "Poor kid. Does anyone know what's wrong with him?" And, sometimes even worse, the laughter of teenagers who mocked his oxygen mask and wheelchair. "Robotnik," they shouted, mimicking the sound of the hissing machine. But the most difficult moment was his every morning at school. Livian hated those narrow doors that his wheelchair could barely fit through, those sharp glances from teachers who tried to hide their pity. Students either avoided him for fear of saying the wrong thing or, like some, deliberately bullied him at recess. And even then, he held his own. But the last day had broken him. "Put that thing away. It's hissing in my ear," one of the older students shouted, and Livian felt a sharp hand yank the tube off his face. There was a flash of panic, a pain in his chest, and the sounds growing quieter and quieter. He didn't remember his mother storming into the school office, yelling at the principal. All he remembered was despair. Life seemed to test him daily, but the worst part was that, deep down, he knew that the world outside their home could be even worse. He hadn't realized how close the shadow of true evil was approaching, the shadow that would change everything in his life. The sound of metal holstering a weapon echoed through the room. Lieutenant Brady Moore stood in front of the mirror, scrutinizing his reflection. His uniform glistened with newness, his badge shining in the light of the lamp. To those around him, Brady was the embodiment of law and order. To himself, an instrument of power. But behind the shiny buttons and perfectly ironed pants lurked a darker essence. His smile at social events was as strained as his belief in justice for all. Deep down, he despised those who differed from him, those who didn't fit his idea of real Americans. Black people, threats to society, people with disabilities, a burden. Whenever he got into a patrol car, he was impatient to catch someone in the act, to feel their fear, to prove his superiority. His shift began as usual. Brady drove slowly along his route, lazily listening to the conversations on the radio. But his gaze immediately stopped when he saw a woman pushing a wheelchair through an intersection. On the wheelchair sat a boy with an oxygen mask, his skinny arms gripping the armrests tightly. "Now, that just makes the day more interesting," Brady muttered to himself as he turned on his blinker. "Hey, you there, stop!" His voice was louder and sharper than necessary. Livian's mother, Irene, froze, tilting her head slightly to look at the policeman. Her face tensed, but she complied, rolling the wheelchair to the curb. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" she asked calmly, trying to keep her voice steady. Brady stepped toward them, his arms around his waist to emphasize his superiority. He quickly glanced around at the boy, the oxygen system, the wheelchair. It all annoyed him more than he could explain. "What kind of circus rig is this?" He grinned, pointing at the oxygen machine. "Are you even authorized to ride with that thing?" "It's medical equipment, officer," Irene said, trying not to raise her voice. "My son can't breathe without it." Sure. He brushed it off, but his eyes narrowed. It looked like an overly complex device. What if it's not safe? "We use it every day," she replied, holding back her anger. But Brady had already decided that his word was law here. "Give me that," he suddenly burst out. Before Irene could realize what was happening, Brady grabbed the tube connecting the oxygen tank to Livian's mask and yanked it sharply. The hissing sound stopped, and Livian's eyes instantly filled with terror. "Officer!" Irene shouted, rushing to her son. "Easy," Brady said with a grin, leaning closer to the boy. "Just making sure it wasn't some kind of homemade thing." Livian tried to breathe, but no air was coming in. His hands trembled and his eyes rolled back from the lack of oxygen. "Give me the phone back," Irene shouted, pushing Brady away. The policeman paused for a moment, clearly enjoying the situation, and then carelessly hung up the phone back. "Relax, Mom. You're so worried. I think you're hiding something." Irene frantically plugged the tube back in, her fingers trembling and tears streaming down her cheeks. Never touch my son again." Her voice was full of rage, but Brady only grinned. "You should be thankful I didn't find you at all. Now get out of here before I change my mind." He returned to the car, leaving Irene and Livian on the side of the road. There wasn't an ounce of remorse in his mind. It was just another day at work for him. But he had no idea that with this routine check, he had set off a chain of events that would turn his life upside down. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from. Have you experienced something similar in your life when you faced injustice or abuse of power? Share your thoughts. It's important. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the sequel. And now we continue. The warm evening was colored by the quiet buzzing of cicadas as Irene, pushing Livian's wheelchair, headed home after the pharmacy. The air was heavy, as if foreshadowing a thunderstorm. The streets were almost empty, with only the occasional car passing by. Livian looked tired, but his oxygen system was working perfectly, providing a steady stream of air. Nothing seemed to portend trouble, but then, from around the corner, a patrol car with its blinkers on came at them. The sharp light struck her eyes, causing Irene to freeze in place. "Hey, you two!" shouted a familiar voice. She recognized the officer instantly. He was the same police officer who had humiliated her a few days ago and put her son's life in danger. Now he was here again, his cocky grin visible even from a distance. "You again?" Irene said, trying to stay calm even though her heart was racing. "Not so fast, Mama." Brady interrupted her as he got out of the car. His hands rested on his belt where his baton and holster hung. "Thought I'd check out what you guys were up to." "We're just going home," she replied firmly. "We're not breaking any rules." But Brady ignored her words. His gaze fell on Livian, sitting in a wheelchair with an oxygen mask over his face. Well, what have we here?" His voice was filled with mockery. "A little engineering project?" "It's medical equipment," Irene said irritably. Equipment my son can't live without? Really? I think it's all a trick, he said, leaning closer to the boy. You know, a lot of you like to pretend to be victims. No one authorized you to decide what is true and what is not. Irene couldn't stand it anymore and raised her voice. Brady's anger flared at those words. He straightened sharply, glaring at Irene. You don't seem to realize who you're talking to. He stepped toward the wheelchair and, before Irene could stop him, grabbed the oxygen tank attached to the back of the chair. Hey, what are you doing? She shouted. Brady began to unscrew the valve, causing an alarming hiss. Livian grabbed the tube in a panic, his eyes widening in horror. Stop! It's dangerous! Irene desperately tried to push him away, but Brady was too strong. Take it easy, he said with icy calm, not taking his eyes off the tank. Just making sure this thing doesn't break any laws. At that moment, Livian let out a strangled wheeze. His breathing became more and more labored, and his face began to turn blue. You'll kill him! Irene shouted so loudly in desperation that the sound echoed through the empty street. Brady froze for a moment, his gaze flicking to the boy. He hadn't expected it to go this far, but instead of remorse, he just tossed the canister back into place and turned to Irene. Learn to respect authority, he tossed over his shoulder, striding to his car. Irene pressed the tube against Livian's mask, trying to restore the oxygen supply. She was shaking with rage and fear. When Brady drove away, leaving them alone on the side of the road, she swore to herself that she would never let it happen again. But even she had no idea that this incident would be the beginning of the end for Brady. The air was heavy, as if the night itself knew what was about to happen. The soft glow of the street lights barely illuminated the road where Irene was pushing Livian's wheelchair again. They were returning from a late doctor's appointment. The night was quiet, but not peaceful. Irene couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. The noise of the engine cut through the silence. Suddenly, blinding flashers flashed behind them, and a familiar voice tore through the air. Well, there you go again, Officer Moore shouted, his words sounding like a taunt. Irene stopped, reluctantly turning around. Livian squirmed in his wheelchair, his fingers gripping the armrests tighter. He, too, recognized that voice, that dismissive tone. Officer, we haven't violated anything, Irene said, trying to keep her voice steady. Well, Brady grinned, getting out of the car and walking slowly toward them. Just patrolling, you know, just making sure everything's okay. His eyes immediately fell on Livian's oxygen machine. The hissing sound of the air supply, which had been comforting before, was now ominous. That tank of yours again, he said with feigned interest, leaning toward the boy. Is it so hard to breathe on your own? It's a medical necessity, Irene replied sharply, covering her son with herself. So, you're giving me orders then? Brady's voice turned cold. He took a step closer, pushing Irene away. Her heart clenched when she saw his hand reach for the oxygen system. No, don't touch him, she shouted, but it was too late. With a sudden movement, Brady shut off the air supply valve. The hissing stopped. At that moment, time seemed to stop. Let's see what you do without your magic pipe. He grinned, leaning toward Livian. The boy let out a faint wheeze, his eyes widened with horror. He tried to breathe, but no air came. His skinny hands grasped the tube helplessly, and his chest shuddered in a desperate attempt to breathe. Stop it! You're killing him! Irene shouted, her voice echoing through the deserted street. Calm down, Mom, Brady said coldly, not even looking at her. I'm just letting him know that he shouldn't depend on other people for the rest of his life." Irene couldn't hold back any longer. She lunged at him, trying to push him away from the wheelchair, but he just swatted her away like a pesky fly. "Stop!" Her scream was almost animalistic, filled with despair. Livian wheezed louder and louder, his face pale. Irene grabbed the valve in a panic, trying to open it, but Brady deftly pushed her hand away. "What, you think you can boss me around?" he hissed, his voice full of hatred. "You're all the same, always playing the victim, always looking for someone to blame. I'm begging you. He's a child." Crying, Irene tried to approach again, but he grabbed her arm and stopped her abruptly. At that moment, Livian made the faintest sound, a wheeze, barely audible but tearing at Irene's heart. She watched her son's life slowly fade away before her eyes. "Enough!" Irene shouted out, gathering all her strength. Her voice was so loud and full of despair that even Brady stopped. He finally let go of her hand and carelessly opened the valve. Air began to flow again. Livian inhaled frantically, but his weak body shook like a leaf in the wind. "See? It's okay," Brady said as if nothing had happened and turned to his car. Irene cradled her son against her, her tears streaming down her cheeks. She watched Brady calmly get into the patrol car as if it were just another street check. But this incident would not go away. Irene vowed that this night would be the last time anyone would allow themselves to humiliate her family like this. Her anger began to turn into something more, a determination to break the cycle of injustice. The flashing lights vanished into the night, leaving behind only a thick silence, broken by Livian's convulsive breathing. Irene was still trembling, cradling her son against her. Her hands were shaking and her eyes burned with a mixture of fear and anger. She knew that this policeman would not stop, that he felt untouchable. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm here." Livian stared at her without uttering a word. His face, weakened by the struggle for every breath, was like a mask of weariness and fear. He couldn't understand why someone could hate him so much for simply existing. But Irene was not going to be silent. In the morning, she stood at the police station, her face flaming with righteous anger. "I want to file a complaint," she said, glancing at the duty officer behind the counter. The man looked up at her, quickly assessing her appearance, dark skin, tired eyes, and her son sitting in a wheelchair behind her. He took his time answering. "Who is the complaint against?" he finally asked with lazy indifference. "Officer Brady Moore. He put my son's life in danger." Her voice trailed off. "Got it," he said, but his tone betrayed complete indifference. He slowly pulled out a form to fill out, placed it lazily on the counter. "Fill this out. All you can do is give me a piece of paper?" Her voice was full of despair. He shrugged as if it wasn't his question. "Complaints are dealt with on a first-come, first-served basis. If necessary, you will be contacted." Irene took the form, but knew it was a waste of time. These walls, these people, they weren't on her side. They protected their own, even if it meant turning a blind eye to evil. Meanwhile, Brady, unaware of the complaint, continued his shift, proud as a peacock. There was not a shadow of doubt in his mind that he was right. To him, the incident was nothing more than an amusing episode. "These people always like to make a big deal out of things," he told his partner while sitting in his patrol car. "Come on, who would believe these complainers?" smirked his partner. "They think the law is for them." Those words boosted Brady's confidence. He felt untouchable. His badge, his uniform, were his armor to hide his hatred and cruelty. Meanwhile, at home, Irene called lawyers, wrote complaints, contacted journalists, but every step she took hit a wall. "We can't do anything unless you have witnesses," she was told over and over again. "The system is not working as fast as we would like it to," advocates said. "Sometimes it's best to just leave it alone," acquaintances advised. Irene couldn't let it go. Each attempt at justice only reminded her more of the system's inaction. The cop who was supposed to protect had become a threat, and instead of stopping him, the system was protecting him. But Irene knew she had something that could not be taken away: her determination. She looked at her son, who sat silently in his wheelchair, and vowed that she would do everything in her power to see that man punished. What she also didn't know was that her closest ally was closer than she'd realized. Fate was preparing an unexpected twist that would turn everything upside down. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our story and whether you have experienced something similar in your life when you faced injustice or indifference of the system. Your thoughts and experiences are very important. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the sequel. And now we continue. Early in the morning, a sharp knock sounded in the office of Chief of Police Richard Carter. He, accustomed to his morning coffee and the half-asleep routine before beginning a long day's work, looked up with slight irritation. He was a tall, confident man with the stern gaze with which he was accustomed to controlling not only his subordinates, but entire sections of the city. "Come in," he said, taking off his glasses and setting the papers aside. The duty shift officer timidly stepped inside, holding a few sheets in his hands. "Sorry to bother you, sir. This just came in. A complaint against our officer, Brady Moore." Richard frowned. Complaints were rare, and each one could mean a potential scandal. He reached out and took the papers. "Thank you. I'll take care of it." When the door closed behind the officer, Richard began to read. His eyebrows gradually drew together at the bridge of his nose. The words on the paper seemed incredible to him. Policeman Moore stopped a mother with a child, a boy in a wheelchair, threatened disconnected medical equipment. The complaint was detailed and sounded so violent that at first Richard didn't even believe it. But then his gaze came across the name: Irene Carter. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. The world around him froze. Irene, his ex-wife, his son. His heart skipped a beat and his hand shook involuntarily. He rose from the table, trying to pull himself together, but panic was beginning to overwhelm him. He reread the complaint several times, as if he hoped he was wrong, that it was just a coincidence. But it was his son, Livian, the boy he saw so rarely because of their difficult divorce, the boy whose life was already complicated enough because of his disability. And this horror had happened under his nose, in the town where Richard was the chief defender of the law. Richard sprang from his seat. He needed to see for himself, to talk to Irene, to find out what had happened. He needed to make sure his son was all right. Irene met him with a stern look. She knew he was coming. "You came," she said, her voice cold, but her eyes were filled with pain. "Irene, what's wrong?" he asked, trying to remain calm, but his voice trembled. "I read the complaint. Is it true?" She burst into a sarcastic laugh. "Is it true? You're asking if it's true? You should ask your officer. Maybe he can tell you how he almost killed our son." Richard felt his heart break at her words. He looked at Livian, who was sitting in the wheelchair, quiet and pale, his small body still tense from the experience. "Livian." His voice softened as he stepped closer. "Are you all right?" The boy raised his eyes to him, full of pain and bewilderment. Those words hit Richard harder than any fist could. He stood up, his gaze icy. "I will not let this go unpunished," he said firmly. "Your words mean nothing unless you do something real," Irene interrupted sharply. "This man thinks he's above the law. If you cover for him, you're no better." Richard remained silent. She was right. He realized that his reputation was at stake, the trust of the town, but more importantly, the life and dignity of his son. Back at the station, he summoned Moore to his office. Brady entered the office with his usual self-assurance. "Sir, what is it?" "Sit down, Moore," Richard said, looking at him as if trying to understand how a man he trusted could do such a thing. "We have a complaint. It concerns your behavior on duty." Brady tensed slightly, but quickly pulled himself together. "Sir, you know how it is. These people often exaggerate." "These people?" Richard asked coldly, his gaze even sharper. "Well, you know what I mean. They're always trying to play the victims, complaining to get money out of us." Those words were the last straw. Richard stood up from the table, his voice full of anger. "These people, as you call them, are my son and his mother." Brady turned pale. I didn't know, sir." "You didn't know? You abuse a child in a wheelchair, cut off his oxygen, endanger his life, and you're telling me that's okay?" Brady didn't know what to say. His self-confidence had evaporated, leaving only fear. "Did you think you could get away with it? That your uniform would give you the right to humiliate and torture people? Number. You'll be held accountable." Richard walked out of the office, leaving Moore alone with his fear. But he knew there was a long fight ahead, a fight against a system that made men like Moore feel above the law, and he was ready for that fight, because this time everything was at stake. In the office of Police Chief Richard Carter, the phone was ringing off the hook. The city, still unaware of the internal storms at the police department, went on with its life. But inside the building, on the top floor, the impending storm was felt by everyone. Richard Carter sat at his desk, staring intently at the documents he had just signed. They were stamped "Internal Investigation." His jaw clenched with anger and his hands shook, but not with weakness, with determination. He rose from his desk and strode resolutely into the main hall of the station. His subordinates, noticing their bosses, fell silent, wary. Brady Moore, standing at the coffee machine, tensed as soon as he felt Carter's gaze. His cocky manner was beginning to crack. He realized that the supervisor had not forgotten what had happened. "Officer Moore," Richard said loudly, causing everyone in the room to turn around. Brady set the cup down, pretending nothing was happening. "Yes, sir," he answered, trying to sound confident. "My office." Now, Carter's words sounded like an order that allowed no objection. Everyone in the room looked at each other. Everyone knew that the atmosphere was more tense than ever. When the office door slammed shut behind Moore, Richard turned slowly toward him. His face was stone, but his eyes were fierce. "Sit down," he said briefly, and Moore obeyed. "Sir, if this is about that complaint," Brady started to say, but Carter interrupted him. "Shut up. You think your uniform makes you invulnerable, that it allows you to humiliate those you think are beneath you?" Brady didn't know what to say. He'd never seen the chief in such a state. "I've put up with your kind for a long time," Carter continued, stepping closer to him. "Too long I've turned a blind eye to your hatred, your arrogance, your tests, but this time you've crossed the line." "Sir, I was just doing my job," Moore mumbled, trying to find an excuse. Doing your job? There was sarcasm in Carter's voice, hiding the rage behind it. Threatening a child in a wheelchair, cutting off his oxygen and abusing his mother? That's your job? Brady tried to object, but Richard didn't give him a chance. As of this moment, you are suspended from duty. Your access card has been revoked. Surrender your weapon and badge now. Those words struck Moore like a bolt of lightning. He jumped up, trying to protest. You can't do that. You have no right. I have the right, Carter said quietly but threateningly. And what's more, I'll do everything I can to bring you to justice. This threat was not empty words. Richard had already set up a commission, contacted the prosecutor, and taken the case to the press. He knew that the system often protected its own, but he also knew that public pressure could break down any barriers. When Moore left the office, his face was pale. His colleagues looked at him, some with bewilderment, others with obvious disapproval. He realized that his days on the force were numbered, but the worst of it was something else. Fear of what lay ahead. Meanwhile, Carter didn't stop. He knew formalities weren't enough. He began to uncover everything behind Moore's impeccable reputation, his past complaints, hushed up thanks to his friends, his hate speech that no one noticed or chose to ignore. When news of the incident began to spread, the city boiled over. The public was shocked. Protests broke out outside the police headquarters. People held placards that read, "Children are not a target." Component placement, justice for Livian. Component placement, stop the abuse of power. Moore became an outcast. His friends began to avoid him, fearing for their own careers. He felt the walls shrinking around him as his every move was monitored, every mistake discussed. Richard knew that this was only the beginning. He realized that his fight for justice was not just about his son, but about the future of all those who should be protected, not persecuted. And he vowed that he would see it through to the end, even if he had to destroy everything he once thought was immutable. The first news report appeared early in the morning. The headline on the television screen was like a thunderclap. Policeman cuts off oxygen to black boy in wheelchair. Mother demands justice. The camera showed Irene's face, exhausted from sleepless nights, and Livian, who seemed still reeling from the horrific attack. The reporter described the events with cold precision, emphasizing that the incident was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a deep sickness in the system. At first, people looked and could not believe their eyes. How is this possible? A police officer, the one who's supposed to protect, became a threat to a child? Public networks exploded. Users wrote comments, shared articles, demanded action. The story spread at lightning speed, capturing the attention of not only the locals, but the entire country. The station where Brady Moore worked became the epicenter of outrage. Within hours of the first report, a crowd had gathered in front of the building. People held signs that read, "Justice for Livian," Zrenia, Detine su criminali, Zrenia, law for all. Irene, standing in the front rows, spoke to the reporters, her voice trembling, but her words were firm. "This is not the first time we've been humiliated," she said, looking directly into the camera. "But I want it to be the last." The crowd roared in response. People chanted her name, Livian's name. The placards bore the image of a boy in a wheelchair, his face a symbol of resistance to injustice. But not everyone was ready to support. A group of police supporters appeared nearby, shouting insults and claiming that the story was exaggerated. "They always play the victims," shouted one of them. "It's all just for money and attention." An altercation broke out between the groups. Police officers tried to disperse the crowd, but tensions were rising. In the center of it all, Richard Carter stood watching. He felt a weight on his shoulders. This was not just a fight for justice for his son, but for the right to be heard for all those who were suffering in silence. Meanwhile, Brady Moore sat in his house, piled with papers, staring nervously at the TV screen. He thought things would settle down, that people would forget. But every minute it became clear that this was only the beginning. His phone was ringing off the hook. Colleagues who used to be his friends were now avoiding him. Their voices were full of fear and disgust. "Look, we can't talk anymore. I have a family too. It's your own fault, Brady. You shouldn't have gotten involved." He felt his world crumbling. His neighbors started to look at him funny. Someone wrote on his car, "Racist." His mailbox was filled with threats. Meanwhile, the protests were growing. People marched through the streets of the city, shouting slogans against racism and police brutality. The police department came under a barrage of criticism. High-ranking officials began making statements, but none of them satisfied the angry crowd. One of the programs was discussing the Livian case. The guest expert, a black lawyer, said, "This is not just one person's mistake. It's a systemic problem. The power vested in such officers allows them to feel untouchable." At these words, the footage switched to Richard Carter, who finally decided to speak publicly. His statement was broadcast to all corners of the country. "As chief of police, I take responsibility for what happened. But as a father, I can't keep quiet. This won't go away. We will make sure that those responsible are punished." His words elicited mixed reactions. Some supported him, others accused him of protecting his son. But he continued to fight. The pressure was mounting. Prosecutors began preparing charges against Moore. An internal investigation revealed that this was not the first time he had engaged in biased behavior. Each new fact added fuel to the fire of public outrage. The protests became so large that they were covered by the international media. Livian's story became a symbol of the global struggle for the rights of the oppressed. People began to take to the streets with pictures of a boy in a wheelchair and slogans, "We will not let our children's breath die." But for Irene and Livian, it was not only a fight for justice, but also for the chance to feel safe. Every night she looked at her son, who held the oxygen mask tightly in his sleep, and thought that despite all the noise and anger around him, no one could give him back the innocence that had been taken from him. And yet she knew she could not stop. Through this struggle, she was not only protecting her son, but also all those who suffered from the system's silence. Brady Moore awoke early in the morning to a sharp knock on the door. A heavy sense of unease pulsed through his head that hadn't let up in weeks. He knew his life was going downhill, but he still couldn't realize how badly. When the knock came again, louder and more insistent, he stood up and headed for the door. 2 officers from the Internal Investigation Department stood on the doorstep. Their faces were as cold as their words. "Brady Moore, you'll need to surrender your uniform, weapon, and badge. You're under criminal investigation." An icy fear gripped him. He wanted to object, but the words stuck in his throat. Just yesterday, he was sure he'd have his back, as he always did. But this time was different. "You have no right," he shouted, breaking into a scream. "There is a right," one of the officers replied dryly, "and it's out of the question." Brady felt the ground go from under his feet as his badge, the symbol of his power, his pride, was swept away. The next morning, his name was on the front page of every local newspaper. Police officer fired after abusing disabled child. He had no cover. The facts were against him. Irene Carter spoke openly to the press, and the words of a woman who had lived through this horror were louder than any excuse. His house became the center of attention. Reporters were on duty at the gate, asking questions he couldn't answer. Neighbors who had once smiled at him and exchanged greetings now avoided even a glance. Soon, threatening letters began appearing in his mailbox. One stood out. "You have deprived the child of air. Now we will take your life." He locked himself in his house, but even that didn't save him from reality. His wife, Sarah, looked at him as if she saw a complete stranger in front of her. "Is it true?" she asked one night when their children were already asleep. "Sarah, you have to understand," he began, but she held up her hand, stopping him. "No, I don't have to. Tell me, Brady, did you really cut off the boy's oxygen?" His silence answered for him. Sarah stood up, her face white with anger. "You've turned us into monsters, Brady. I can't be a part of this anymore." After a few days, she packed up and took the children to her parents. The house that had once been his refuge was empty. Things got even worse at work. Colleagues who had once clapped him on the shoulder in a friendly manner now avoided him. Their gazes were contemptuous. "He's tainted us all," one of them said as Brady walked by. Rumors and ridicule spread like wildfire. Each new day brought news that his case had been taken to court, that his actions were considered an abuse of power accompanied by racial hatred. "You ruined your life yourself," the senior officer told him when it was time to finally leave the station. Brady tried to make excuses, but each time his voice sounded weaker and weaker. Outside, people chanted his name, not with support, but with contempt. Posters with his face crossed out with a red cross hung all over the city. He could no longer go out into the street. Every step he took was met with hostile stares. Every visit to the store was accompanied by whispers behind his back. "It's him," people whispered. The policeman who tortured the child in the wheelchair. His house was getting quieter and quieter. With no family, no friends, no job, he was surrounded only by his thoughts. They tormented him, making him relive again and again the moment he had leaned over the boy and cut off his oxygen. He remembered Livian's eyes filled with terror, his hands desperately grasping the tube. His fall was complete. He had lost everything: his job, his reputation, his family. But worst of all was the realization that it was his own fault. And somewhere in the back of his mind, in that silent house, he knew that his punishment was just beginning. The city did not forget the case for a long time. Local newspapers and TV stations never stopped talking about it, turning Liviona Carter's story into a symbol of the fight against injustice. The high-profile case touched thousands of people, making them think about a world in which children in wheelchairs are victimized by those who are supposed to protect them. But, however widely the story has spread, for those involved it has left scars that will never heal. Irene, despite all the pressure, continued to fight for her son. After the trial, which ended in a guilty verdict for Brady Moore, she still didn't feel completely satisfied. Her main goal was always not revenge, but to change the system. Her speeches at rallies and in the media became the voice of those who suffered in silence. "I don't want other mothers to go through what I went through," she said at a press conference. "We are not asking for special treatment. We are asking for justice." Livian was by her side. His small figure in a wheelchair became a symbol of resistance. His face appeared on banners. His name was heard in the speeches of activists. But for a long time, Livian himself could not shake off his fear. Every night he woke in a cold sweat, his small hands instinctively checking to see if the tube was in place. He dreamed of Brady Moore's face, the smirk, the cruelty, the moment when the air stopped flowing. Irene did her best to support him, but knew this fear would stay with him for a long time. Richard Carter, watching all this, realized how deeply mistaken he was in thinking that the system could work on its own. He had to reconsider many of his beliefs. He initiated reforms within the administration. "We have to change the way we serve the people," he told the officers' meeting. "I will not allow my subordinates to feel they are above the law." But his struggle was not easy either. Many officers, who were used to the old order, saw him as a traitor. "You ruined your career for them," a senior officer told him as he left the station. "If it means I save one life, so be it," Richard replied, not even making eye contact with him. As for Brady Moore, his life had become a shambles. His firing, lawsuit, and prison sentence left him with nothing. But even more painful was the realization that his actions were the cause of widespread hatred. In prison, he was repeatedly the victim of ridicule and aggression from other inmates. "This is the cop who cut off the kid's oxygen," they said, and their words were as harsh as their blows. He found no peace, day or night. He began to have nightmares. The same boy's eyes, the look of terror in his eyes. And, for the first time in his life, he felt something he had never known: shame. The system began to change. After Moore's trial, the city instituted a new training program for police officers to eliminate bias. Irene and Richard spoke together at meetings, sharing their experiences to prove that change was possible. While it wasn't a quick win, the first steps were taken. For Livian, however, the story was a reminder of his own resilience. His mother often told him, "You survived. You're stronger than they ever imagined," and he believed her. Despite the pain, despite the fear, he knew that his story had changed the world around him. This tragedy left deep wounds, but at the same time it gave hope. Hope that justice is possible if you fight for it. Hope that even in the darkest of circumstances one can find the light that will light the way for others. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you experienced racism in your life? Your stories and thoughts are incredibly important to us, and we appreciate each and every one of you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like if this story touched you. We wish you a wonderful day, and always remember that together we can make a difference in the world.